Hi, friends, and welcome back to the Big Book Project. My name's Lori Feathers, and today I want to talk a little bit about week two of our reading of Roberto Bolaño's 2666. This would be the second half of part one of the book entitled The Part About the Critics. We're picking up at page 85 and going to the end of part one, actually. Before we get into the text, I just wanted to acknowledge and thank all of you for joining the Big Book Project. It's been a really great launch of the project. I think we had some really great discussion on the Substack for week one. Some good comments coming in from readers regarding all kinds of things. The joy of big books, which I certainly uh, is a topic near and dear to my heart. Also, just kind of the the mystery that is involved in trying to figure out, what parts of these situations that we find our primary characters, the critics in, are going to be important for the narrative going forward. Uh, what's the significance of their dreams? We talked a little bit about on the Substack interpreting some of those dreams and what they might mean. Also, some discussion about the incident of the assault of the Pakistani taxi driver by our critics, which was shocking and disturbing, I think, for pretty much everyone that read. But a few of you wrote in with comments about that. So I really very much appreciate all of those great comments. And please keep talking on the Substack. I want to make this a very participatory an engaging kind of forum for us to talk about this book. And although I'll only be posting on Substack twice a week, I will be supplementing those posts with these podcasts and some video outtakes and things like that. So hopefully, no matter what your preference is from week to week, you'll be able to kind of get some really good uh, discussion and thoughts to accompany your own about the book. So to start with today, I wanted to kind of talk about some things that happened pretty early on in this week two reading. The first of which is going to be about this artist that we were introduced to in week one, Edwin Johns. This is someone who Liz Norton, you might recall, tells her fellow colleague Morini about, and about this artist's very dramatic kind of exit from the illustrious art world, where he was producing some kind of collage mural type self portraits and shockingly mutilated himself by cutting off his right hand, the hand that he primarily paints with, and attaching that to these self portraits in an embalmed kind of state. A very intentional act on his part, and one that kind of made him famous for perhaps all the wrong reasons. Um, but we see this artist again in this week's reading, and it comes about in such a way that we are told about it kind of after it's happened. You'll recall at the end of week one, we kind of have Liz Norton and her two colleagues slash lovers, Pelletier and Espinizo kind of kind of calling a halt to their affairs romantically because of this horrible kind of unexpected event with the Pakistani taxi driver where uh, they just kind of the two men engage in unspeakable kind of violence, unprovoked for the most part, violence against this taxi driver. And Liz Norton is like, "Cool it, guys. I really think we need to take a break. I'm not really interested in seeing you anymore." That kind of leads to the two men kind of visiting prostitutes for a number of weeks, months, I'm not quite sure, and kind of forgetting a bit about Liz Norton, but not really. The three, though, kind of reunite after a conference and in London, and at that time, the two men tell Liz Norton about this uh, weird kind of visit that they took with Morini to the lunatic asylum. That's the way that Bolaño describes it, uh, in the Swiss Alps, where the artist Edwin Jones is recovering, getting help, living essentially since this self mutilation, and it's Marini's idea to go visit the artist. He's obviously been quite taken with this story about the artist that Liz Norton told him. So they travel by car to the Swiss Alps, to the asylum where Edwin Norton is staying. And Morini introduces himself to Edwin Jones as an admirer of his work. And Jones immediately assumes that Morini has perhaps purchased some of his art. Morini dispels that notion by saying, "No, like I couldn't afford your art, unfortunately." But after some kind of back and forth and chit chat, um, Morini quietly goes up to Jones and asks him, "Why did you mutilate yourself?" And Jones says, "I'll tell you why I did it." And he walks up to Morini and he whispers something in Morini's ear. You'll recall Morini is crippled, he's in a wheelchair. So this whispered exchange is something that Pelletier and Espinizo they don't overhear. But they all get back in their cab after this kind of what would seem like an uneventful meeting with the artist, and drive back to their hotel. It's quite late when they get back. They go to their respective rooms, and Pelletier and um, Espinoza discover the next morning that Morini has left. He checked out of the hotel in the middle of the night. Um, so the two men are quite disturbed by this. Don't know where Morini is. Are concerned about him because they know a little bit about the effect that this artist has had on their friend, and they start trying to call him, assuming that he's returned to Turin, to his home. That no one picks up. They call his office at the university. They find out he's missed some classes that he was supposed to teach, and so they're in a bit of a panic. Um, and they tell this story to Liz Norton, and you'll recall it was Liz Norton that first told Morini about this artist and the fact that he cut off his arm, or his hand rather. And Liz is really surprised that Morini um, went and had this visit, and furthermore, that she didn't know anything about it because it so happens, she tells Pelletier and Espinoza, that during that time when they were trying to find Morini after he checked out of the hotel and they assumed he was back in Turin, he was actually in London with her. And he didn't tell her that he had visited Edwin Jones with the other critics. But as he's getting on his plane in London to return home, He tells Liz Norton that he thinks he knows why Edwin Johns cut off his hand. And he says, I think he did it for money. And so the whole thing is kind of still shrouded in mystery. Is that really what Morini heard uh, Edwin Jones, or Johns rather, say about the reason why he did it? And what's really going on with Morini? Why did he decide that he needed to just go to London? Why did he hang out with Liz Norton but never told her about this extraordinary visit and interaction with Edwin Johns? So a lot of questions still remain. There is one item though that I wanted to dwell on with respect to this discussion that happens before Edwin Johns whispers in Marini's ear and then walks out of the room, ending the meeting. And that is what Johns says about fate. And fate's something that's going to come up again and again in the book. In fact, in several more chapters, and maybe it happens in week 3 or 4, we're going to come across a central character whose last name is Fate, Fate. So Bolaño really couldn't emphasize more for us that fate is something that he's very much thinking about in this book. But Edwin Johns's theory of fate and coincidence is quite interesting. He tells the critics that the whole world is a coincidence, and that coincidence is the flip side of fate. It's total freedom, and it's our natural destiny. He says that coincidence is the manifestation of God at every moment, a senseless God making senseless gestures at his senseless creatures. So it seems that, to me anyway, Johns is kind of equating um, coincidence as chaos, something that is the flip side of fate and the opposite of order or fate or redemption. And this issue of fate is going to come up even in this discussion today, again, in another context. So let's move on a little bit and talk about um, the amazing discovery that our critics make that their idol, Archimboldi, the German writer who is a recluse and whose work they've dedicated their lives to, has actually been cited recently in Mexico City. And this news comes to them from a young scholarship student that they meet at an Archimboldi conference in Toulouse. And the student's name is Alatorre. He's from Mexico City. And he just casually mentions to the critics that one of his friends met Archimboldi just the other day in Mexico City. And he kind of says it off the cuff, not thinking much about it. He's not really what the critics, in their snooty way, consider a real Archimboldi expert. And maybe he doesn't realize, they think, how big of uh, a mystery Archimboldi's whereabouts are for the entire literary world that follows him. And so Alatorre is urged by the critics to give them all the details about this sighting. And Alatorre tells them what he knows, and that is that he has a friend in Mexico City who's a novelist and also a government official. This man is known by his nickname El Cerdo, which means the pig. And Alatorre says that the pig was called in the middle of the night to go to a hotel room where the German writer was staying. Um, El Cerdo, the pig, knows German, and so he enters this room. There are some government officials, police, I imagine. They're in the room, and the author, who El Cerdo learns is Archimboldi, is sitting on a bed. He's in a t-shirt and jeans. He's 7 feet tall. Um, El Cerdo knows Archimboldi's work a little bit, but not very well, and he has no idea how Archimboldi got his phone number. Um, but he hangs out with Archimboldi that evening. Archimboldi doesn't really tell him much in answer to his questions. Um, but he does say one important thing for our critics, and that is Archimboldi tells El Cerdo that he's flying the next morning to Sonora. And specifically, he's going to a town near the US Mexico border called Santa Teresa. He doesn't really say what he's going to do there or why he's going or even what he's doing in Mexico. But this obviously is very interesting and important information to our critics who glam onto it immediately and want to uh, go to Mexico City to see if he's really there. Um, of course, we know so very little about Archimboldi. He's a very tall man, 6'6", or taller. He is an older man, probably in his 70s. He was a World War II deserter. He's considered a writer on the left. He's on the run for some reason. He's referred to as a reminder of Europe's past, which is interesting. And so our critics are asking themselves, what is Archimboldi running from? Um, why is he just seeming to be continually on the move and wanting to avoid uh, the press, other critics, just the world at large? Um, the next little vignette that I want to talk about is one of my favorites so far, and this is when the critics are deciding that, well, if he was just seen and talked to a few days ago in Mexico City, we all need to go immediately to Mexico City. This is in the context of Archimboldi once again being spoken about as a potential winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature. And so our critics, although they're just fascinated by Archimboldi generally, they're also a bit motivated by the idea that, well, maybe they can bring Archimboldi back to Europe to accept what they hope will be the announcement and the winning of the Nobel Prize in Literature. But our friend Morini, who's in the wheelchair, and as we just talked about, had the weird experience with the mutilated artist Edwin Johns, decides that he's not going to travel to Mexico City with his friends, the other three critics, and his reasons for not are really, I just think quite lovely. And the inspiration for his deciding not to go is actually a story about another author, a real author, the French novelist Marcel Schwab. And we get just a very brief summary of the story of Marcel Schwab, who, when he was in ill health, set out to visit the grave of one of his literary idols, Robert Louis Stevenson, who was buried on the island of, or a small island in the South Pacific. Um, on the way there, it was a very long and arduous journey by ship at the time. He contracted pneumonia and nearly died. And when Schwab finally arrives at this island in the South Pacific, he doesn't get off the ship to even go to the grave that he's suffered for weeks to reach. And his reasoning at the end of the day is, what's the point of visiting the grave of someone who hasn't died? Stevenson lived inside of him. And it's, I think, kind of um, a beautiful thought for all of us who so love literature and books, so many books by authors that we can't hear from anymore. We can't listen to podcasts where they're guests or watch interviews of them, but they still seem very much alive to us because what they've done and their work and the voices that they've created just reside in our imaginations and in our minds. So anyway, that's why Morini says he's not going to go to Mexico City. He tells his friends that he's just not well enough, and the doctors have said, he can't travel. But I think it's really just poetic and quite lovely, this reasoning in his mind why he doesn't need to go. Perhaps Archimboldi lives inside of him, and he doesn't need to meet the man, touch and feel the man to appreciate his work. Um, and Bolaño tells us that this is the beginning for Morini of beginning his own internal voyage. Um, he becomes resigned, meek. Um, he seems to feel as though his self-image is dissolving gradually and helplessly. So I don't know that it's necessarily an unpleasant kind of evolution for Morini. Um, but it's interesting that with this decision comes this kind of abandonment or letting go of maybe some ambition or some level of striving that he had always felt inside of him, and he's just beginning not to feel that way anymore. We'll get more Morini coming up. I think he's an endlessly fascinating character, and he's kind of my favorite so far. The last thing that I want to talk about with you all today is another beating of a taxi driver, this time in Mexico City, that thankfully our three critic friends are not directly involved in, but that they all witness. Not together, Pelletier and Espinosa witness this on the ground as they are in the lobby area of the hotel. Liz Norton watches it from the window of her room on the fourth floor. And this beating is by the hotel guards. It involves a apparently drunk guest who gets out of the taxi, and there's a dispute between the intoxicated guest and the taxi driver over the fare, and some shouting occurs. The guest gets out of the taxi, and then the hotel doormen, security guards, just start beating the Mexican taxi driver. So that's quite stunning and extraordinary that we get in such a short short frame these two beatings of taxi drivers. Another kind of theme that we're going to see with the critics now that they're in Mexico um, is this kind of superior, condescending attitude that they have towards the Mexicans that they encounter, and just I don't know, they're very culturally ugly at this point. I think they have this kind of superior feeling. They kind of laugh and joke about uh, what they see around them. They're only in Mexico City one night before they go to Santa Teresa, where they believe that they will find um, Archimboldi, but uh, they they both in Mexico City and even more so in Santa Teresa, which is not as cosmopolitan as Mexico City. We see this really uh, ugly and unattractive attitude that they have towards the locals. Um, when they get to Santa Teresa, it's interesting. I noted at the beginning today that some of you have talked about the dreams and interpreting the dreams. Well, right away, when they get to Santa Teresa, we are told that um, the the critics check into their respective rooms, which are on the same floor and nearly identical, but they each have a distinguishing characteristic. Espinosa's room has a giant painting of the desert with a group of men on horseback. Liz Norton's room has two mirrors instead of one, and the mirrors are positioned in the room in such a way that if she's standing in a certain position, she can see herself in one mirror and see her back in the other. So they kind of reflect one another. And then Pelletier, unfortunately, has a room with a big chunk of the toilet about 8 inches missing. I'm only mentioning this because it would seem like a rather meaningless detail, except for the fact that each of the critics have dreams that first night about this distinguishing characteristic in their room. And so I'll be interested to hear from you guys what you think these dreams might mean. One of the things that happens when they get to Santa Teresa, though, is they go to the university and they are met by a man who's been charged by the rector of the university to be their guide, so to speak, and he's a professor there called Amalfitano, and he isn't so happy about being a tour guide for these European um, critics. He knows Archimboldi's work a bit. It's interesting because he, unlike our critics, seems to see Archimboldi as he really is. He kind of tells the critics, well, maybe Archimboldi shouldn't be found because obviously he doesn't want to be found, which the critics just dismiss outright because, of course, they kind of feel like it's their right and almost maybe their fate or destiny, talking about fate, to find to find Archimboldi, to confront him, to talk to him, to make him be their friend. Um, also, Amalfitano says that, you know, maybe Archimboldi isn't the greatest German writer, and that is kind of that honesty is kind of funny because, of course, our critics disagree wholeheartedly. Their reputations, I guess, and their professions kind of bank on the fact that Archimboldi is the greatest German writer of the century. Um, and Archibald, or I'm sorry, Amalfitano even talks about some of the hotels in the area, and they're looking up these hotels. They're visiting them, trying to see, whether any guests have checked in that meet Archimboldi's description, or under his name, or under the name of a pseudonym that he seems to be traveling under, Hans Reiter. But at one point, they have exhausted all the local hotels, and all that are left are motels, these kind of rundown places that mostly prostitutes um, hang out at. And uh, Amalfitano kind of thinks to himself, despite the critics, kind of dismissing the fact that their hero could be at one of these not nice motels, says something along the lines, well, or thinks it rather. I don't think he says it aloud. I actually could kind of see Archimboldi staying with prostitutes at one or more of these motels. So it's interesting that Amalfitano isn't this sycophant when it comes to Archimboldi the way our critics are. There's another thing about Amalfitano that I want to just mention in closing, and that is his kind of thoughts about fate, which we will talk a lot about uh, later on. We'll get really into Amalfitano's mind because, as you might know, if you've looked at the table of contents, while part one is the part about the critics, part two is the part about Amalfitano. So we will get up close and personal with him soon, next week, actually. But Amalfitano declares that exile abolishes fate. And that's something that our friends find quite an interesting and almost contradictory statement. He tells the critics, when they ask about his personal life, that he was obliged to choose the path of exile. He was actually born in Argentina, but left there in 74 when the political crisis there occurred. And Norton says to him, exile must be a terrible thing. And Amalfitano says, actually, I see it as a natural movement, something that in its way helps to abolish fate, or what is generally thought of as fate. And Pelletier says, but exile is full of inconveniences. It interferes with anything you try to do that's important. And Amalfitano says, but that's just what I mean by abolishing fate. So again, we have this question about fate coming up, and the question about, what does fate mean when we live with this chaos and these things that are not part of our free will. I think maybe Bolaño is telling us that it's not just this dichotomy between destiny and free will, or fate and free will, but rather there's this element of chaos that we all experience in our lives, that maybe is something that's other than free will, certainly, and maybe something that's not quite fate either. So it'll be interesting to explore this topic with you guys. And finally, I just want to mention the weird fact that we have a lot of characters that we're being introduced to now whose names start with A. We have Alatorre, who was the Mexican scholarship student that told our critics about Archimboldi, another A, being in Mexico City. We have Almendro. Almendro is the pig, El Cerdo's real name, real last name. And then we also have Amalfitano. And I guess, especially when it comes to the three Mexicans or the three Latin American, because Amalfitano is actually Argentinian by birth. Um, what that might be saying about this issue that I talked about with our critics being very disdainful, critical, sarcastic, kind of mockingly cruel about the people that they're encountering in Mexico. Uh, could it be that Bolaño is trying to underline here, to emphasize the fact that our critics see all of these people as basically the same, that they look at them with disdain and in a way that kind of blocks their humanity? Anyway, it's been really fun talking to you today about where we are with the book, about our reading for week 2. I haven't touched all of the text in week 2, not even close, but I'm hoping that you'll get on Substack and write and read with me there, what happens and what you're thinking about it. And please continue reading, and I hope you're enjoying. I look forward to hearing from you. Bye-bye.